Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always, I'm joined by my co-presenter, John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. And you can visit our website, irishhistoryshow.ie, for a full archive of all our previous episodes. You can follow us on Twitter, @IrishHistoryPod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media, as we really do appreciate it, and we're very grateful for all the support we get from you, the listeners. We have a great show for you today. 2021 marks 100 years since the creation of Northern Ireland. To discuss this and the events that led up to the partition of Ireland, we're very pleased to be joined by Dr. Cormac Moore. Cormac is an historian in residence with Dublin City Council. His previous works include the GAA versus Douglas Hyde, the Irish soccer split, and his most recent, Birth of the Border, the Impact of Partition in Ireland. Cormac, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you, Carl.
Just to start off, when did partition first become mooted as a solution to the Home Rule crisis in Ireland?
There had been rumblings during the first and second Home Rule crisis of separating the northeast of Ulster, treating the northeast of Ulster differently. Particularly Joseph Chamberlain, who was a liberal, who became a liberal unionist. He was against Home Rule, and he actually believed that there should be some kind of federal solution, and he suggested Home Rule parliaments in Ireland, in Belfast, and also even in Scotland, England, and so on. So he was kind of the first to mute it, but it wasn't really taken seriously then. There was probably no need, because first and second Home Rule bills were defeated through normally parliamentary procedures. The Ulsterisation of unionism really began from 1905 with the creation of the Ulster Unionist Council. And the main problem with the third Home Rule crisis was Ulster. It took centre stage, and particularly the opposition from Ulster Unionists, who were backed by their allies in Britain, the Tory party. That's when it really became taken seriously for the first time. You actually had a backbencher Liberal MP, TJ Agger-Roberts. He actually put down an amendment to exclude 4 counties from Home Rule of Ireland. And actually, the Ulster Unionists put down their own amendment of excluding 9 counties. So from then on, from 1912 onwards, there was a lot of talk, not just within Ulster Unionists or Tory circles, but even in the cabinet. Lloyd George and Winston Churchill supported a county-by-county exclusion at a very early stage. And then when it became obvious that Ulster were taking this very seriously, that they were arming themselves, they created a provisional government, they were supported to oppose Home Rule by every means possible by Andrew Bonar-Law, the leader of the Tory party, who was considered an Orange man and a fanatic by many people at the time. Then Herbert Asquith, the British Prime Minister, decided that we're going to have to do something about Ulster. And we also have to remember the Unionists were very lucky with their allies in the Tory party, who really stuck by them, and whatever the Unionists threatened, whether it was a civil war or using arms, the Tory party were in many ways committing treasonous talk by supporting them in such measures. But the Irish Home Rule Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, were not so lucky with their allies. The Liberal Party were quite lukewarm on Home Rule. Asquith didn't have that kind of crusade that Gladstone brought to the Home Rule issue. He was looking at ways of accommodating unionism, and that's when John Redmond was approached to consider some form of Home Rule.
Cormac, by the time of the Home Rule crisis, you'd already been through a previous Home Rule crisis in the 1880s. You had the famous phrase, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. But, a century before that, it wasn't axiomatic that Ulster Protestants would support the Union. And so how different was the North from the rest of Ireland, and why were they so insistent that they wanted to be excluded from Home Rule?
Yeah, but that century, the 19th century, counted for a great deal in what happened, particularly with Belfast. Everything happened really from Belfast, which became the nerve centre of Ulster Unionism, opposition to Home Rule. And that changed. It was a very small city at the start of the 19th century. It actually overtook Dublin by the late 1800s as the largest city in Ireland per population. But most importantly, it actually was very different in its, commonality with Britain in terms of adopting the Industrial Revolution. It was a hugely successful city. It had a thriving shipbuilding industry, linen industry, and a lot of other auxiliary industries that spawned from its success in shipbuilding and linen. And many people in Belfast saw themselves as very different than Irish. They considered themselves law-abiding people, whereas they saw the rest of Ireland as lawless people. They had a very different experience with the land wars in many respects as well. And they saw, obviously, the biggest difference was the religion factor, where there was a huge concentration of Protestants in the northeast, particularly Presbyterians. Presbyterians took a lot of kind of control of the issue from the 1800s, and they were very, very heavily concentrated in the northeast, much more so than Church of Ireland or Methodists. So a lot of differences were developing. And the problem is that if we look at that simplistic binary option between Protestant Unionists and Catholic Nationalists, we forget that there was a lot of nuances there. It wasn't as clean cut as that. Many parts of Ulster were as backward as Unionists would think, or rural as were parts of Connaught or Leinster or Munster. And also there was a huge Catholic population in Ulster. Even in 1913, there was actually more Nationalist MPs than there was Unionist MPs in all of Ulster. And so it's too easy just to think that all of Ulster became against Home Rule when there was big parts of the province that was for Home Rule and also experienced the same kind of quality of life as the rest of Ireland did.
And to what extent was religion, not religion as like a marker of identity, but actual religion a factor? The famous Unionist slogan is "Home Rule will be Rome Rule."
Absolutely, it was a huge factor. And even before the Third Home Rule Bill was introduced to the House of Commons, there was a number of incidents that didn't help the Home Rule cause. The Natimara doctrine that basically said that any mixed marriage should go through the Catholic Church. And there was a very infamous case where a woman, Mrs. McCann, she was married to a Catholic, Alexander McCann. She didn't want to have her marriage through the Catholic Church. The marriage broke down and the husband took off for the children. And this was huge news at the time. And then you also had another directive from the Catholic Church that you couldn't take a court case against the Catholic Church without talking to a bishop. So these are all happening at the time of the Third Home Rule crisis. So this definitely was a very big concern for Protestants in the North. And there was a genuine fear that Home Rule would be Rome Rule. Now, but if you look at the Third Home Rule Bill, it was very specific. In fact, Michael Logue, the Cardinal and Primate of all Ireland, he wasn't a big fan of the Third Home Rule Bill because he saw the Catholic powers diminishing. Catholic discrimination was prohibited under the Third Home Rule Bill. So although unions had fears, in some ways they were alleviated by the actual framing of the Third Home Rule Bill.
Now, Cormac, could we talk about unionism as a nine-county phenomenon? Afterwards, it's almost as if the 6 counties had existed from time immemorial. But when you look at things like the UVF and the Ulster Unionist Council, they were organised on a 9-county Ulster basis, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the most fiercest Covenanters were actually from Monaghan or Cavan or Donegal. Absolutely, the whole thrust for opposition to Home Rule around the time of the Third Home Rule crisis was a 9-county phenomenon, as you said. Now, it became impractical for Ulster Unionists, though, to think that they could get all of the 9 counties. They didn't really want it, and that crystallised over the coming years. But they did feel that it was too close for comfort in terms of the population numbers. We're obviously just going on the 1911 census because that was the last one before partition and the one subsequent to 1926. But at 1911 census, you had about 55 Protestant, 45% Catholic in Ulster. So they would not have had a strong enough majority, they felt, with the 9 counties. This really came to a head in 1916, and then obviously with the Government of Ireland Bill, it really caused huge friction within Ulster Unionism. And people from Monaghan, Cavan, Donegal were absolutely disgusted by being thrown to the Southern administration. And they did bring up the fact that they were as strong supporters of opposition to Home Rule as anyone else in Ulster was. And they also died in great numbers in the Battle of the Somme, fighting for the 36th Division. So Yeah, it did cause huge friction within Ulster Unionism.
Well, as you say there, Cormac, when you look back at the Ulster Covenant, it really implies not an inch of Ulster will be given up, not an inch of the 6 counties will be given up.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to look at Edward Carson. A lot of people say he was only interested in all of Ireland remaining within the Union, and he was opposed to partition. I just don't see how that adds up. I think a lot of what he has said is misquoted. He to me was a person who put forward partition, but specifically 6 county exclusion. He told Bonar Law that it's going this way, it's going towards the exclusion of 6 counties, and I'm going to make sure that it's permanent exclusion. That was in 1913, and then that's the policy adopted in 1914 publicly, particularly at the Buckingham Palace conference in July of 1914, just before the start of the First World War, where he insisted we did not want a stay of execution, we want permanent exclusion of 6 counties. They never said 9 counties. They were very specific on 6 counties. And that was led by Carson. And Craig behind the scenes, but Craig played a much more prominent role in making sure it was a 6-county solution with the Government of Ireland bill.
And Cormac, there's a famous quote from Carson that's wheeled out at every opportunity, what a fool I was and so on, implying that Carson wasn't happy with the creation of Northern Ireland. But it's more complicated than that, as I think you're fond of saying yourself.
The amount of people I hear misusing that quote to say he was opposed to partition, he wasn't. This was his maiden speech in the House of Lords after the signing of the treaty. He was saying that Ulster Unionists were treated as puppets in the game of getting Conservative Party into power, because he believed that the Conservative Party had betrayed Ulster Unionists by trying to get them to go into an All-Ireland Parliament as opposed to through Westminster. And he also felt that the Conservative Party conceded far too much to Republicans with the treaty. So it certainly was nothing against partition. It was giving too much to Sinn Féin, as he saw it.
Yeah, now we're going to get on to the nuts and bolts of partition and the creation of Northern Ireland in a second, but I want to have one more question about Southern Unionism. So when did the relationship break down between Ulster Unionists and Southern Unionists? Because it seems that the latter was very much cut adrift by their Northern brethren.
Yeah, it was going that way from 1912. And Carson was actually quite dismayed with the Southern Unionists. He just felt that they weren't doing enough, and they'd accepted their loss, that they were going to be in a Home Rule Parliament. Once the idea of excluding Ulster or part of Ulster came up, that's when you see this drift. But that worsens over the years, particularly from 1916 when Lloyd George tries to bring about a solution, and Ulster Unionists through Carson vote heavily in favour of 6-county exclusion. And then even the Irish Convention, you see Southern Unionists working with the Irish Party to come up with a kind of a home rule solution for all of Ireland, which is totally opposed by Ulster Unionists. So it really becomes public and becomes almost terminal by 1917, by the time of the Irish Convention, and it only gets worse after that. By the time Home Rule Parliament is suggested for what becomes Northern Ireland, many Southern Unionists actually create an anti-partition league. By that stage, it was the split was pretty much final.
Yeah, people generally wouldn't consider it today, but if you do look at the results of both the 1918 election and the local elections in 1920, there is quite substantial unionist votes in places like Dublin and Cork. It's not just an Ulster phenomenon.
Well, there does seem to be a difference between Northern Unionism and Southern Unionism, that Northern Unionism seems to be more broad-based. There's a lot of middle-class involvement, and at a ground level, there's a lot of working-class involvement, whereas Southern Unionism, and maybe this is unfair, but it seems to be a lot more deferential. There's a lot more titled aristocrats in the running of Southern Unionism. How do you think that had an effect?
Just on that point, it is a very good point you make, because that is true. There's a far greater depth to the support for Ulster Unionism among the classes. And that in many ways was down to Craig in particular, and also you could say Carson as well, in that they unified all of pretty much Protestants in the North East to be opposed to Home Rule. The labour issue was becoming quite large. It was dangerous for Ulster Unionists. And even though the leaders of Ulster Unionists were from the upper layers of Ulster society, the support for Ulster Unionism was cross-class support. That, you could see, was a major achievement by Ulster Unionists. They remained united throughout this whole period, even when there was a lot of issues that were, you would imagine there would have been a lot of commonality between bread and butter issues that Protestants and Catholics would have faced in places like Belfast. and they did cooperate to some degree. But when it came to the political issue of the day of being part of United Ireland or being part of Britain, there was a huge support in Ulster, and it was very unified against Home Rule and ultimately for partition. So there's a big difference there. And you're right about Southern Unionism. It was always mainly, the landed gentry, upper middle class, was made their main support was, and where most people who were involved in the organisation politically would have been from.
And, we often speak, as you said, Cormac, in binary terms of nationalists and unionists. A third factor, though, is Labour. What was the attitude of the different strains of Labour politics to partition from the early days onwards?
Labour were in a dilemma, no question about it. Particularly in the north, you had most of the people who led Labour actually were anti-partition. Not necessarily because they were nationalists. They just feared a orange government, the Ulster Unionist government, more than anything. But their supporters were primarily unionists. So it was quite difficult, and they had to tread a fine balance, often by just ignoring the national issue and focusing on bread and butter issues, welfare and jobs and so on. But it was quite difficult. But then you also had trade union bodies, like the ITUC and INTO, who did become political, and they were seen as being aligned with Sinn Féin. They supported the anti-conscription campaign, whereas there was little support for that in Belfast. They backed away from contesting both the 1918, 1921 elections. And they were seen as some members of those unions as being pro-Sinn Féin, and it did alienate them from them. So it was quite difficult. After partition happened, most trade unions maintained their All-Ireland presence, as did most other organisations. But they had to be mindful that Northern Ireland was a different place, so they had a kind of devolved setup. They democratised their structures a lot more, and they actually created a Northern Ireland Committee, so that they accepted there was a difference, but they still wanted to maintain a 32 county presence.
Well, Cormac, what was the reaction of Northern nationalism at the start of the Home Rule crisis?
First of all, I think as in 1886 and 1893, they felt that it would go away. Maybe it was a bit of bluff by unionists. But then they realised, that unions were serious this time, and that it was a lot different than before, and particularly with the Conservative Party so strongly backing Ulster Unionists. That's where you have the idea, like where Redmond starts canvassing the Catholic Church, and he asked them, would we consider something like a temporary home rule of some of the counties, but to come back into a home rule parliament eventually. And it really is this kind of opposition within not just Irish nationalism, but with Northern nationalism really kind of goes centre stage in 1916. And Lloyd George is always duplicitous. He offers Carson permanent exclusion, and he offers Redmond temporary exclusion. So Redmond has to try and win over Northern nationalists to this. And he's backed by Joe Devlin, the leading nationalist MP in Belfast. There's a big difference between those who knew that no matter what solution was going to happen, they were going to be in a partition solution because they were in Belfast, and that was never going to not be in an excluded zone. But the nationalists in Fermanagh, Tyrone, and in Donegal and Cavan and Monaghan, all along the border, what became the border, they had a very different view. They were totally opposed to it. But ultimately in July 1916, Redmond and Devlin were able to swing enough people to vote for that solution. They were adamant it was only temporary. But at this time, Sinn Féin is rising because of, obviously, fallout from the Easter Rising. But not just that, it's also the Catholic Church swung in many ways against the Irish Party because of its seemingly support for, compromising on a regular basis on partition. And even Joe Devlin admitted himself, for all the compromising and talking we've done, all it's done is alienate our supporters. And that was actually a big factor in the 1918 general election, as well as the conscription crisis, which really was the nail in the coffin for the Irish Party. And then you have a different brand of nationalism, Sinn Féin. But there was also different viewpoints within Sinn Féin as well. Michael O'Flanagan, famously said that we can't expect unionists to come into an Irish setup if we don't want to be in a British setup. So there were some people who would have accommodated different solutions, and certainly not all Sinn Féin members wanted a republic. So it's quite complicated. There was a lot of different strains of viewpoints on nationalism. But the universal belief was that there shouldn't be no partition, no permanent partition. And that's always remained the case within nationalism, whatever strain it is.
I mean, there's kind of an irony, though, isn't there, where Sinn Féin, as you rightly say, excoriated the parliamentary party and John Redmond for temporarily accepting partition in the Home Rule crisis. But Sinn Féin were no more successful at reversing it than the IPP were.
Absolutely, yeah. If you look at Sinn Féin's policy in the North East, it's very incoherent if there is a policy. And that in many ways is because they weren't strong in the North compared to where they were elsewhere in Ireland. If you look at the 1921 Northern election, the first Northern election, of the 6 MPs elected in that Parliament, only one was not elected also in a Southern Ireland constituency. And most of them were leading figures in the South, like De Valera, Collins, Griffith, MacNeill, so on. So, they weren't strong on the ground compared to where they were elsewhere in the North. They didn't think about it. They genuinely believed that once Britain left, that, Unionists would happily come into United Ireland. Like, totally naive, and totally misreading of the absolute stringent opposition, violent opposition that unions had towards the Dublin Parliament. And they totally misread that situation. Their first policy on the North was really the Belfast boycott, which in many ways led to more permanent partitions, certainly more of a psychological partition. So the first time they really dealt with it as a policy was from the truce onwards and through the treaty negotiations. They had to actually deal with it head on. But at that stage, you could say that the horse had bolted because, Northern Ireland had been set up, and their incoherence remained. They still kept on claiming that, it was all down to British guile, nothing else, and unions would come in. They blundered greatly when it came to a coherent policy on the North.
I mean, viewing partition as a nationalist problem, there's kind of 2 different issues, isn't there? Like, there's people like Fermanagh, Tyrone, Derry City who could see themselves accommodated within a small partition in the southern state or the nationalist state, let's say. But for, let's say, Catholics in West Belfast and east of Ulster, it's a different problem, isn't it?
Yeah, as I was saying, they knew that they were going to be in some partition settlement. And in many respects, even though Joe Devlin and All Irish Party, what became the Irish Party, of the Irish Party afterwards, they did support the Boundary Commission, and they wanted to see, a plebiscite, which would have seen big parts of the border areas go to the south. But I'd say a lot of them were okay with it remaining a bigger minority of Catholics in partition, as opposed to, a rump state where there would be a lot fewer Catholics, and they felt they could be mistreated a lot worse if that had been the case. So yeah, there was this dilemma within Northern nationalism. For areas around, Derry City and Tyrone and Fermanagh, they genuinely believe, with the Boundary Commission, I know I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but they always felt it was a temporary solution and that they would eventually go into the Irish Free State. So they obstructed and ignored the Northern institutions as best they could, because by accepting it, then they felt that would kind of lead to a level of permanency to it. So they believed the best policy was to ignore it, ignore the institutions, recognise Dáil Éireann, and that created a lot of problems as well.
So there is an impetus to get some type of a home rule settlement on the books and come to some type of solution. Particularly after 1916, you have the rise of Sinn Féin. There's all the stuff going on with the First World War. What is the British reaction? How do the British go about trying to get everybody on board to have some type of workable solution?
Well, they didn't try to get everyone on board. That's the reality. They thought up this idea of an Irish Convention in 1917 to allow Irish people to solve their own problems. But that was a gigantic failure, as FSL Lyons said. But then after the war, we have to remember that the Third Home Rule Act was on the statute book. So that was going to come into the law once the peace treaties had been signed. Now, I think the final peace treaty was signed, I think, in the early to mid-20s. So, they actually had a bit more time than they realised. But they didn't know that. So they actually decided in the summer of 1919 to repeal, basically, instead of repealing the actual Third Home Rule Act, to bring in another one, the Fourth Home Rule Bill, which became the Government of Ireland Bill. So Lloyd George set up a committee led by Walter Long, a rabid anti-Sinn Féiner, a rabid unionist, and there was zero contribution from nationalists whatsoever. So there was no attempt by the British to involve nationalists of any hue, in providing a settlement for Ireland at that stage. The Government of Ireland Act ultimately was a way to solve the Ulster question and not the overall Irish question. In the way it was framed, and even with the actual amendments to the original bill, were all in line with what Ulster Unionists want. They wanted some part of Ireland to work this, because they knew that they'd lost the other part of Ireland. So they wanted a solution, a kind of a ready-made solution within Ulster and then before they went and talked to the rest of Ireland. But that's not clear cut either, because I think even Lloyd George was very lukewarm about the Government of Ireland bill. The person who proposed it in Parliament, Ian McPherson, who was pretty much on the way out, the Chief Secretary of Ireland, he was lukewarm on it. So there was kind of this belief at the time that this wasn't going to come into being anyway. This had less support than any other Home Rule measure. Ulster Unionists didn't want it either. So yeah, was it going to work? At the time, there was very little hope for it actually coming into force.
Yeah, I think you can say that there's a clash between two different agendas here, even on the, let's say, the pro-British side. You know, there's the people who believed in the empire, who were happy enough with a united Ireland and Home Rule as long as it was a loyal Dominion. And then there was the Ulster Unionists, who are in a way a kind of nationalist, a kind of minority nationalist in a way.
Yeah, but I think with the Ulster Unionists, though, were always more aligned with the empire than with actually Britain itself. You know, that was kind of a lot of their Britishness kind of came from this notion of empire and being part of that empire. But you have to remember as well the arithmetic. And I've always said this: the phrase often goes the look of the Irish, but from 1912 onwards, it was the look of the Ulster Unionists, because everything went their way. Not just that in the 1918 election they had a huge success. It wasn't just Sinn Féin who had a great election; it was Ulster Unions as well. But most importantly, in 1918, it was the election results in Britain, where Lloyd George's National Coalition won a huge majority. But importantly, for Ulster Unionists, the Tories were by far the biggest party. So Lloyd George, who had nominally supported Home Rule for all of Ireland in 1912, he was hamstrung by the Conservatives, who had some members who were as opposed to Ulster in a Home Rule settlement as Ulster Unionists were, people like Bonar Law and Balfour and so on. So they were in the heart of government, and in many ways they were controlling government because they had the biggest number. They had the more numbers than Lloyd George's Liberal coalition. So yeah, the dynamics within Britain as well were very important at the time. And Lloyd George, who, let's be quite frank about it, morally didn't really care. To him, it's all about him getting that settlement. All he wanted was a settlement. He didn't care what it was, as long as it was a settlement. But at that juncture, he was hamstrung by the Conservative Party, who nominally were very supportive of the Ulster Unionist cause. One of the only things they had in their manifesto about Ireland was that there should be no coercion of Ulster into an All-Ireland Parliament. Now, that did wane, in the intervening years, but it was strong enough to actually bring about the Government of Ireland Act, and even the great threat to Northern Ireland after it was founded with the treaty negotiations. That Conservative base came to Craig and Northern Ireland's cause and led to the ultimate solution that we had.
So Cormac, could you talk about the Long Committee and how it looked at the issue of the border, and not just the 6 counties, but maybe rejigging the actual boundaries of those 6 counties?
Well, the Long Committee originally proposed that 9 counties would form the Ulster Parliament. So the Northern Ireland Parliament would have been 9 counties. And they were quite adamant on that, because on paper, they were saying they wanted United Ireland ultimately, and they're going to bring in what measures they could that United Ireland will organically happen. And they felt that it would more likely happen with a far greater Catholic minority in the north through 9 counties as it would with 6 counties. And they obviously wanted this Council of Ireland as well, which would have had 20 people from each parliament, north and south, meeting together and working. And they had a lot of cross-border bodies, related to railways. They even suggested a common Supreme Court, but they changed that when it came to the final act. So there was a lot of attempts on paper to work it so that it would be towards United Ireland. But Craig's a very important figure here, because at the time Craig was actually in the heart of British government. Walter Long, who led the committee that devised the Government of Ireland bill, he was suffering a lot of ill health. He suffered a huge amount of ill health for much of his life, and he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. Craig actually was his what we would call junior minister. He was the financial and parliamentary secretary. Because Long was away for such long periods with ill health, Craig in many ways became the First Lord of the Admiralty. So he had close contact with all of the people who were involved in devising the solution for Ireland. And he actually asked for a boundary commission. He did not want 9 counties. He felt it was too insecure for unionists. As I mentioned previously, it was about 55-45 Protestant Catholic. You might have had a 3-4 majority in Northern Ireland Parliament, which is very unstable. So he wanted a lot bigger majority, and he insisted on 6 counties. And failing that, he referred a boundary commission of the area so that it would be more clean cut. Of course, when the treaty negotiations, when he wasn't involved in, he was totally opposed to this odious boundary commission, but he obviously had his citadel at that stage, so he didn't want an inch to be removed from his territory. The pressure developed from Ulster Unionists that it had to be 6 counties, and there was a lot of internal debate within Ulster Unionism. And as I mentioned earlier, Unionists from Cavan and Donegal were disgusted and left the Ulster Unionist Council in great numbers. So only when the Government of Ireland bill came to the House of Commons in the spring of 1920 that the British government backed down on the 9 counties parliament and insisted on 6 counties.
One of the what ifs here is what was proposed in 1920 in the Government of Ireland Act was 2 home rule parliaments, one in Dublin, one in Belfast, and a Council of Ireland with a view to eventual reunification. And one what if is, what if the Southern nationalists, by now dominated by Sinn Féin, had accepted that? Was there a possibility of unity on that basis?
Maybe there would have been eventually, but I just think the environment, we have to look at the environment at the time. The War of Independence was starting. The fact that no nationalists were even consulted, like, why would nationalists accept a solution when they have no consultation whatsoever? They haven't been involved in the framing of it. They didn't even get to meet any of the long committee, although there were some nationalists left in House of Commons. I think there were 7, like 6 in Ireland and T.P. O'Connor in Liverpool. They decided not to get involved in the Government of Ireland bill either. And actually, Joe Devlin said it himself, though, this is the first time that the British government decided that instead of Ulster being or part of Ulster being excluded from Dublin Parliament, but actually remain in Westminster, they actually created a home rule parliament for Ulster. And Devlin knew this was very dangerous. This was actually the worst type of partition and permanent partition. It would have been a better solution for United Ireland, I personally think, if counties had remained within Westminster, than what happened. And actually what developed was a northern citadel for Protestant rule, and that could only have happened through an Ulster Parliament. So I think nationalists were very wary of what was happening. And then they saw, as the bill was being drafted, all the changes were favouring Ulster Unionists. The ability to remove PR came up, which was a big safeguard for minorities. And when that was kind of removed as a safeguard, that was a big problem for Catholics. You had loads of other amendments as well, which really favoured Ulster Unionists not being ever part of the United Ireland. It's very unlikely you could get a solution when the 2 main warring parties, for want of a better term, are not involved in those negotiations. It's a bit like Jared Kushner's solution for the Israel-Palestine conflict last year. He only spoke to the Israeli side and didn't expect the Palestinians to accept it. Why would they accept it if they're not involved in negotiations?
Yeah, and of course, one of the problems is that Sinn Féin have moved so far beyond home rule. Now they're demanding complete independence.
They are, but that's not as clear-cut either as well. As I said, not all Sinn Féin would have accepted a republic. In fact, they didn't accept a republic. They accepted Dominion settlement. So Sinn Féin was not as dogmatic as a lot of people have made out. And Unionists did speak to Sinn Féin. Craig met with De Valera in May 1921. He met with Collins and had pacts with Collins in 1922. So there was a lot more scope than you would think there was. Even in All-Ireland bodies, where councillors were working together, Sinn Féiners did work with Ulster Unionists. So, this idea that it was a binary, 2 parties kind of would never talk to each other, nothing to do with each other. Yeah, there was a lot of people, absolutely held that opinion, but it wasn't as clear cut as some make out. I do think Sinn Féin had certainly had a point in the British involvement in all of this. It's not just the case that the Unionists didn't want to go into United Ireland. The security forces that they had, and in many ways all of the measures they took, were supported and paid for by the British. The Union's opposition, I don't think, would have been as strong if they didn't have the full support of the British Treasury and money and political power.
Well, unionism's big justification for wanting to be excluded from home rule was that this was an area where people didn't give their consent to be ruled under a Dublin Parliament. But when we look at the 1920 local government election results, there are county councils and rural district councils and corporations that don't vote unionists. So like this argument that unionism is giving, that the 6-county area is going to be largely homogenous unionist and the people in this area don't want home rule under Dublin Parliament, doesn't really ring true.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Actually, there was a meeting of the chair people of the county councils of Ulster, and after 1920 elections, 5 of them were actually nationalists. Only 4 were unionists of the different counties. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Actually, the 1920 local elections is a very chastening moment for Ulster Unionists. It was a very poor result for them. Labour did extremely well, as did Nationalists. Nationalists took control of Fermanagh and Tyrone, and for the first time since 1688, there was actually a Catholic Lord Mayor of Derry. It was a hugely embarrassing election for unions. And I would imagine, and just looking at the archives, it really spurred them on to do really well in the Northern Ireland Parliament elections, which they did tremendously well. Out of the 52 seats, they won 40. In fact, all 40 unionist candidates were elected. They were very aware of what had happened in 1920 local elections, losing those vitally important councils. They actually lost a lot of other urban councils, rural councils as well, you wouldn't have thought of before. Belfast, where they always had a huge majority, that was dwindled a lot from 1920. It does put paid to that whole notion that it was a homogeneous area of Protestants and Unionists. There was a lot of different groupings in the north than often meets the eye.
The Unionist narrative, Cormac, on this is that it's an act of self-determination and so on. And the nationalists, Northern nationalists especially, rejoinder is that the reality is also that right from the start, there was violence directed against the Catholic minority, right from the beginning of the Home Rule crisis in 1912 and before. So how did violence accompany partition?
It came to a head really in the summer of 1920. First of all, the IRA was beginning to make some inroads into Ulster. There's a lot less activity, 1919 in Ulster than there was in the rest of Ireland. And you see it in Derry, first of all. Adrian Grant has written about sectarian killings on both sides in Derry. And this moves further east to Belfast only a few weeks later, particularly after the 12th of July. And you've got Carson plays a prominent role of rising tensions and saying, we'll have no Sinn Féin, we will do whatever it takes to stop Sinn Féin, this invasion of Sinn Féin coming into the north. So then they started rejuvenating the Ulster Volunteer Force. Remember, they still had all their arms from the Third Home Rule crisis. So they already had a lot more arms anyway than the IRA had. The IRA's numbers of arms was a lot less in Ulster than it was in other parts of Ireland. There was a genuine belief amongst Ulster Unionists that Sinn Féin and IRA were going to do exactly in Ulster what they had done in other parts of the country. And you look at the RIC was literally shrinking in size. It was only in a few big barracks at that stage outside of Ulster. And Ulster Unionists saw this as a big threat. What is hard to reconcile this, though, is that when a prominent figure is killed, like Smith or Swansea, just the sheer scale of the attacks on Catholic properties, on lives and so on, it's hard to reconcile with that. But it's just not commensurate with what they saw as a threat. And most of the violence and expulsions were directed at normal, civilian Catholics who weren't involved in the conflict at all. And the numbers were too great to go, this is a real threat. This is a coordinated campaign in many respects, with the burning of houses, the burning of businesses. You do see an element of people trying to remove Catholic populations from whole towns or whole areas. It's very sectarian in nature, the violence, compared to other parts of Ireland. And obviously this is all happening as the Government of Ireland bill is going through Parliament. And Joseph Devlin says this, he's incredulous, going, why are you going through with this bill? I mean, look at what's happening in the north. How can you have these people? You're going to give them full powers of government when they're doing this to our people. That wasn't listened to by the British government.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems, I suppose, with talking about this as two equal sides is that they're not treated equally by the British government. So, for example, you talk about the rearming of the Protestants, but one thing you see in 1920, Cormac, I've seen this from looking at the border region, is the Unionists are disarmed by the state in response to IRA raids for arms, but then rearmed again in what's effectively a militia and the Ulster Special Constabulary.
Yeah, well, they had their own vigilante groups. You had Basil Brooks in the Fermanagh Vigilance, and you had others in Armagh. And they were supported by Ulster Unionists, but what they have claimed is that they wanted to make sure that there wasn't too much indiscipline and that they were in control of the levels of violence that could be perpetrated by the loyalist community. So Craig insisted that basically what was going to be the membership of the UVF would actually be a legitimate army. Because the UVF at the time was not a legitimate army. It was a legal army. If they got killed or something happened to them, they had no rights whatsoever, even though the British turned a blind eye to what they were doing. Craig insisted and got an Ulster Special Constabulary, which was paid fully by the British, but it gave them legitimacy to carry out acts against with the IRA, but ultimately the specialists got involved in a lot of reprisals and just targeted Catholics, let alone members of the IRA. And that was given legitimacy by the British. And very importantly, it was financed fully by the British. You're talking huge money. I'm looking at the archives in Kew, the UK archives. And for 1922 alone, I think Craig was saying normally security would cost about £2.5 million a year, which was a lot of money at the time. But 22 was so bad that they had to get an extra, double that amount to deal with the security issues, all paid for by the British. So it definitely wasn't treated like at the time.
Cormac, what was the reaction of the nationalist community to the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament in 1921?
Well, I think the best person to sum it up would be Cardinal Michael Loeb. He was invited to the opening and he declined because he had a prior engagement, as he said. The nationalist community, if you look at the huge celebrations when King George V comes to Belfast, there's a big problem there, and that you've got a whole community absent from those celebrations. It was one community embraced him, one did not. In fact, the IRA responded by attacking some of the troops at the border between Louth and Armagh, Adivile, and killed 4 soldiers and 80 horses the day after the opening of the Parliament. So you also had, as I mentioned before, the county councils like Fermanagh and Tyrone. They decided to ignore the new entity and paid allegiance to the Dáil instead, as did many other rural and urban district councils. So ultimately the nationalists decided, we're going to ignore this as much as we can. We're not going to get involved in this jurisdiction whatsoever. All the nationalist MPs, only 12 of them out of 52, 6 Sinn Féin and 6 UIL, they didn't take their seats in the Northern Parliament. As the Northern Parliaments elected the Senate became fully unionist as well. So you had basically only one community actually embracing Northern Ireland and accepting it as an entity, whereas Catholics pretty much ignored it as best they could for the first while anyway.
Ronan Fanning argues that the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament cleared the way for the truce in the south and negotiations with the Republican leadership in the south. Do you go along with that? Do you think that they saw the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament as settling the Ulster question, and now you move on to the relatively easier, from their point of view, Southern question?
Yeah, it's definitely a factor. I presume you're referring to Ronan Fanning's Fatal Pact, which is a wonderful book. It really is. It's a fantastic book. My only issue with that book, and I actually do genuinely think it's a great book, is that he's too ready to accept the British viewpoint, and actually go along with the obstacles they had. I just felt he could have worked a bit more on the nuances within British and the flexibility they had in terms of some of their movements. But he's right to some degree about the British cabinet. Even from 1920 said, look, we want to get the Northern Parliament up and running before we even talk to Sinn Féin. And even in late 1920, once the Government of Ireland Act was passed, there were a number of opportunities to have a truce at that stage. And one of the reasons was to look, let's get the Northern Parliament up and running. The British military told the British cabinet that they'll have the situation under control by April, May 1921. So let's have the elections then. And Jan Smuts, the South African leader, he was heavily involved in this, and he said, look, you have Northern Ireland up and running. It is partition, it's copper fastened, even though I would argue it wasn't. And now is the time to get a settlement. But it wasn't the only reason. There was no point in the British continuing on with the war, really, because they tried a lot of tougher measures and they weren't working. May and June were the worst months for British and police casualties. And the only other option other than a settlement was go, as Neville Macready, the British Commander-in-Chief in Ireland, said, go all out or get out. And if you look at the go all out option, it just wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to be palatable to the British public. It wasn't going to ultimately stop the strength of the IRA. In fact, it would have brought more people to the IRA ultimately. So they're going to have to come up with a truce anyway, I think. But that did give momentum though. And King George V's speech, opening Parliament, was considered a conciliatory speech of forgive and forget, and did pave the way for talks between De Valera and Lloyd George.
So Cormac, how does the Anglo-Irish Treaty deal with the issue of partition?
Well, it does deal with it a lot. I do think people often just think that the Anglo-Irish Treaty was just about sovereignty and that was it. The main arguments and disagreements that arose, not just with the treaty negotiations, but even the build-up to those negotiations with the talks between De Valera and Lloyd George, Ulster was the problem, ultimately. Sinn Féin would have accepted Dominion Home Rule settlement on an All-Ireland, if it was an All-Ireland basis. They never even asked for a republic. Well, De Valera said, look, if you're not going to give us have Ulster in All-Ireland Parliament, we want full independence for the South. But he devised his external association idea, which wasn't a republic. Ultimately, Ulster was where things hinged on. And what is often forgotten is that Craig was under huge pressure at the time from Lloyd George and others, even members of the Conservative Party, people like Austin Chamberlain, who actually was the leader temporarily, while Bonar Law was recovering from illness. They tried to pressurise, Jan Smuts tried to pressurise as well, Craig and his colleagues into accepting, you have your Northern Ireland Parliament, but it has to be autonomous within Dublin Parliament, not Westminster. And they put a lot of pressure on, not just in July, but in November as well. Griffith noticed that once Bonar Law returned to the scene, and you had Churchill as well, was prominent, as well as Balfour, who was always for a full exclusion of Ulster. Craig's resolve didn't waver at all, and he stuck to his his notion of not an inch, what we have we hold. We're going to stick on our impregnable rock. So but there was a lot of pressure. If you look at all of the talks that happened in October to December, a lot of it came down to Ulster, and that's where the whole idea of this boundary commission comes up. Lloyd George realises that Ulster's not going to waver at all. They're never going to accept a Dublin Parliament. He gets Tom Jones, his cabinet secretary, to broach Griffith and Collins with the idea of a boundary commission. And Griffith actually thinks this is actually good. This ultimately gives us huge chunks of Northern Ireland. Collins wanted a plebiscite. He was adamant it should be a plebiscite. But Griffith thinks it practically gives us that plebiscite. And even De Valera is okay with it as well. Once the treaty divide happens, even his alternative document number 2, has the same provisions on Ulster as the treaty did. So the Boundary Commission, to me, is probably the biggest spectacular blunder of Sinn Féin throughout this whole period in accepting the Boundary Commission. Not because of a Boundary Commission per se, but just the way it was written, the ambiguity of it. The amount of holes in that document, or that clause of that document, are frightening. And they had legal people with them at the conference. Like Charles Gavin Duffy was a lawyer. So how they didn't see that this is, just nothing but pitfalls here. How can we accept such a vague, indistinguishable clause? And particularly that notion of, we will look at, we will change a boundary in line with inhabitants, as long as it takes into economics and geography into the equation. There had been loads of plebiscites. There was a lot of partitions happening at the time around Europe. Most recently Upper Silesia, and they all got plebiscites. Now Balfour said we don't give plebiscites to victorious nations; they're only for loser nations from the First World War. But the Sinn Féin, I certainly believe, could have got a plebiscite. They should have demanded that at the very least. And the British government were always mindful of world opinion, and they knew that they could not fall down at Ulster because they had a very weak moral case, particularly when it came to Tyrone Fermanagh. That's why you often hear about Churchill talking about the dreary steeples of Tyrone Fermanagh, or even Lloyd George saying, I do not know who will die for Tyrone and Fermanagh, who would die for throne and empire. They didn't have a strong case on the whole 6-county region being part of Northern Ireland, and they knew that. And that's why Sinn Féin should have stuck to their gun about a plebiscite, because they would have got a solution which would have given Tyrone and Fermanagh a big parcel anyway to the Free State.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Cormac. And you find it hard to imagine that the Unionist leaders would have accepted something so ambiguous for their side. And as you say there, with the economic factors being brought into account with the ambiguous Article 12, the Unionists could have made the point that we need Derry City for our economic viability. We need South County Down for the water supply for Belfast. There's so many reasons why they could say we're not losing that part, we're not losing this part.
Well, what happened afterwards? Like the Unionists were, and you can understand where they were coming from as well. They were totally against the Boundary Commission because it did put big areas of their territory on their threat, and they were not a party to those negotiations. Even though you could argue their government, the British government, was the ones who negotiated on their behalf. But they felt they weren't a party and that they were being lumped with this Boundary Commission. It increased the already existing paranoia there. It increased the insecurity, particularly around the border regions. In fact, Craig said to Churchill in May of 1922 that this is the root of all evil, this Boundary Commission. And they decided not to go with it at all. They were wavering. Actually, Eric Carson was thrown up as being the Northern Ireland Commissioner on it at one stage. They decided to wait it out, and obviously events changed in the south and governments changed in London as well. in the interim period. And ultimately, the British government had to select the Northern Commissioner for them, who actually, again, with the look of the Ulsterman, who couldn't have been more unionist in outlook than if they had selected him themselves, with Joseph R. Fisher. But at the time of the actual treaty, the unionists were disgusted with the actual boundary commission, and they weren't going to work it. But then they actually decided to change the structures, in many ways, of the 6 counties through abolishing PR, through gerrymandering councils to make them more unionist in outlook looking. And you even mentioned the water supply issue. The actual unions decided in the early 1920s, after the treaty had been signed, to actually create the water supply for Belfast in the Mourne Mountains. So that then became a reason for keeping Newry in a north with the Boundary Commission. And even if you look at the Boundary Commission's meetings and its deliberations, they seem to skew all their economic and geographic factors in favour of the north and not of the Irish Free State. So there was a lot of bias there as well. That begs the question: why did Owen MacNeill stay in the Boundary Commission, and why didn't he do his job properly? That's another question again as well.
Well, that does seem to be a major question. That MacNeill seems to be a one-man band. He doesn't seem to have been getting any civil service support or discussing things with the cabinet. It seems incredible looking back that he did such a poor job, really.
It is, yeah. It's very hard to give him any positivity what he did. He just didn't. He didn't consult the Irish Free State cabinet. The commissioners were meant to deliberate amongst themselves, but Joseph R. Fisher in particular was leaking everything to everyone, so everyone knew that. Whereas MacNeill just wouldn't play ball with the Irish Free State government. And then he says when he resigns, when it becomes clear with the leaked report from the Morning Post in late 1925, and when he resigns, not only from the commission but also from the cabinet and also even from the Dáil, he says maybe I wasn't the best person to speak with. Also, he had a full-time job as Minister for Education. The other 2 commissioners, Fisher and Feetham, their job was commission. So, and they were from a legal background. He wasn't, and even though he's from the north originally, from Antrim, but he should have had someone like Kevin Shields, who ran the North Eastern Boundary Bureau, who knew the issue inside out, who was a solicitor. He's from the north as well. He would have been a far better option to be commissioner than MacNeill.
I wonder how much the British were prepared to give. I mean, we have quotes, for example, in correspondence between Lloyd George and Churchill, where Lloyd George says our position on Ulster is not a strong one. And what he's referring to is that they're going to be ruling over a lot of Northern nationalists, mostly Catholics, who don't want to be in Northern Ireland. And he's aware of that. He's aware that most of the west of Northern Ireland is very discontented with the settlement.
I don't think he was just saying for that reason, and that was a reason. I think it was also for the world opinion. Their position wasn't a strong one, particularly in America. And he said we're being eaten alive from a propaganda point of view. And that was always an issue. Even during the treaty negotiations, that British wanted the negotiations to fail if they did on sovereignty, whereas Sinn Féin wanted them to fail on Ulster if they did. And that's why Sinn Féin are often, I think, unfairly criticised for the treaty negotiations in that they kind of ignored Ulster. That's not true. Ulster was a huge part of their arsenal throughout the negotiations, and they kept on bringing it up. But even after the treaty and all of that, yeah, there is an argument. But particularly Lloyd George was gone from late 1922. So when it came back to Boundary Commission being issued, it changes in government. In fact, it was the first Labour government who appointed Joseph R. Fisher as Commissioner, Ramsay MacDonald's government. But then Nationals would have always thought the Labour Party would have been favourable to their cause, because Labour in opposition had been opposed to partition. But then they were ousted out of government in November 1924. So by the time the actual the government came around, it was a strong majority government led by Stanley Baldwin. And he said, look, don't worry, to Craig, nothing's going to change here. You're going to have the territory you want.
One of the ironies, though, I think, and we've talked about the treaty and how it worked out as regards its clause about partition. But one of the ironies in the post-treaty period is that the pro-treatyites don't think that they've signed up to a solidifying of partition. It's actually the pro-treatyites, in particular, Michael Collins, who are the strongest about partition, certainly from a military point of view, but also from a civil point of view, things like funding nationalist councils in the north. Isn't that an irony?
Well, I don't know if it is an irony, because no nationalist was pro-partition, so and that still is the case. You can talk about the iterations of Sinn Féin or even the Irish Nationalist Party. No one wanted partition from a nationalist perspective. And Michael Collins, would have to say, of all the Sinn Féin leaders, seemed to care about partition more of an issue than the other leaders did. It really did affect him a lot. And in fact, Lloyd George said to Churchill that we can get him to talk about nothing else. But his policy was all over the place as well, though. He was, on the one hand, he was arming the IRA and having loyalists kidnapped, and he was nominally supportive of the Northern Offensive in May. But then on the other hand, he was saying that I'm going to make this work. We had pacts with Craig in January and March, and obviously had these obstructionist policies as well. He was the one leading that. Even before he was killed, there was actually changes in Northern policy. So this is also important. And Ernest Blythe comes to the equation, and he's a very different viewpoint on how to treat the North than Collins did. And so does Cosgrave, and so does Kevin O'Higgins. So it depends on the personnel and the pro-treaty side you're talking about. They all had different policies, but the control that Collins had as chairperson of Vision Government, and then the head of the military as well, he had huge control over all of policy up to his death. So when you talk about pro-treaty side, you're really talking about Collins in many respects, who really cared about the North. When he leaves the stage, you have a different viewpoint from the Cumann na Gael pro-treaty government. But
one of the outworkings of Collins' position is that a lot of the Northern IRA actually fought on the pro-treaty side in the Civil War, which seems bizarre, in hindsight.
Yeah, no, it does. Collins did a great job of getting their support. People like Ona Duffy as well, and Sean McKeown, and yes, and that is true. Most people from the IRA in the North did support the pro-treaty side. But obviously, we had both pro and anti-treaty sides fighting together. At one stage in the Civil War, in all but name in the North, in the first half of 1922, and Collins wanted that kind of to prevent civil war by having a unified policy on the North from both factions.
But as it happens, of course, the Southern Civil War over the treaty did break out, and again, one of the unexpected outworkings of that was it was the Southern side who imposed the customs border.
Yeah, that to me, it's something I brought up a lot in my book, Birth to Border, is this creation of the customs barrier. In many ways, this is when partition really starts to affect people's day-to-day lives. I'm not obviously making light of the violence that accompanied partition. That did not affect every person, though. It was in certain pockets of areas, particularly in Belfast and even along some border areas. But then when you have the introduction of customs, that's when the tangible day-to-day effects of partition become obvious. We can't cross the other side of the border without being stopped. Even though there was free movement of people, every person was stopped because they could have had goods on them. And then that's when the actual partition becomes intrusive. James Craig said himself, there was no partition before customs barriers, and he wanted the customs barriers removed for all time. The arguments put forward by the Free State, being allowed to have their own tariffs, was only given to the Sinn Féin delegation in the final hour of the negotiations. Before that, they were meant to have the same fiscal policy as Britain. But Griffith really wanted that. He believed that when Britain sneezes, we catch a cold, and we're totally dependent on Britain, and we need to be able to develop our own kind of fiscal customs policy. So those are the reasons. It was to make money as well for the Czech. Very much beleaguered Exchequer. The Civil War was about to end. It's still happening in March, April of 23, and they also believe that this is going to help and destabilize the North. It's actually it's going to prohibit partition. In fact, the opposite happened. That Northern Ireland wasn't as dependent on North-South trade as it was on East-West. So in many ways it solidifies partition. It made it more tangible, it made it more real, and it even made it more difficult for the Boundary Commission, which hadn't met yet, to actually change the boundaries, because you had these infrastructures, these huts, this whole paraphernalia that comes with the creation of a physical border. And that was all developed by the Irish side, the Irish Free State side.
Well, Cormac, it's really interesting in your book, the way you go into the difficulties of just the logistics of creating two separate states and separating all these different bodies like the legal system and the civil service, and how this affects civil society as well. Things like sporting bodies, religions, all these different things. Can you talk about that, please?
For my PhD, I did a chapter on how my PhD was mainly about sporting divisions, but I looked at the whole division within the Northern Ireland context as well. But one thing that struck me when I was looking at other jurisdictions that either have been partitioned or united, you could be talking the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Germany, so on. One thing that's very unusual about the Irish partition story is that most bodies at the time did not follow suit with the political decisions. They ignored partition. Whereas you go to most other countries, if there's a political partition, usually you'll have a sporting or religious, an organisational partitions as well to coincide with the political partition. That never happened in Ireland, and most bodies remained all Ireland bodies after partition, and still are. You look at most sporting organisations, all the major religions except for Judaism are on all Ireland basis. A lot of trade unions, a lot of trade organisations, they just ignored the international frontier. And in many respects, you had actually unionist politicians who were totally opposed to unity on a political side, were calling for unity in sport. People like John Andrews, the second Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, was embracing an All-Ireland Hockey Association and said, if it wouldn't be great if we were like that in politics as well. You had other people as well that culturally they were very happy to maintain an All-Ireland presence. But when it comes to the political issues, both sides have been further and further apart. So that's very unusual, kind of a reaction to partition in Ireland compared to other countries.
One of the points you make in your book, Cormac, is that it was the Northern administration that was brand new. The Dublin administration was in some respects a successor to the pre-independence administration.
People have often said, that Ireland was never united before partition, so we're not looking to reunite the country because it's never united in the first place. But in some ways, it was under the Act of Union. The British treated Ireland like a very separate entity, and actually, and all this paraphernalia administration of government was set up in Dublin, and not just public bodies, but in a lot of private organisations set up their machinery from Dublin as well. So by 1921, you had this huge infrastructure around government, around private sector, all headquartered in Dublin. And that had to be broken asunder. So it was quite easy for Dublin government, in my respect. Even if we take the example of the legal situation, they had two kind of legal entities, as in the British Southern Ireland paraphernalia, the four courts and all of the other buildings and legal frameworks, King's Inns and so on. And then they had their own homegrown Dáil courts. Whereas the North had nothing. They had a couple of buildings they could use. They didn't have a Supreme Court, so they had to build that. That took a similar time scale as it took to build Stormont. So they had a temporary courthouse in Crumlin Road in Belfast, Antrim County Council offices, which were not adequate at all. And then you had so many other examples of where Belfast was creating government departments from scratch through the work of Ernest Clark, the main civil servant responsible for this. But they had very little to go with. He said himself, I'm armed only with a table, a chair, and an Act of Parliament. He defined buildings for the departments. He defined the personnel for those each department. He defined even accommodation for the personnel. He defined furniture. He had to map out the buildings. A huge gargantuan task. Whereas Dublin, when the British left in the beginning of 1922, had most of those kind of infrastructures in place.
And Cormac, you've alluded already a little bit to the post-partition and post-treaty setup in Northern Ireland as regards politics, like they redrew electoral boundaries and so on. And, it became a state which very much discriminated politically anyway against Catholics and nationalists.
Look, I mean, no doubt about it, but Northern Ireland was a cold house for Catholics for decades after partition. And first of all, you have the security element, the specials remains, and it is just a Protestant force. The RUC was created in the summer of 1922. They want to have 1/3 Catholics in the RUC on paper, but they have to accept 1/6 in the end. And that dwindles down to 1/10 by the 1960s. The civil service, the big problem for Catholics was they have to have an oath of allegiance to the state and the king. And that's a big problem in terms of joining the civil service and other areas as well. And then you have people like Dawson Bates who doesn't want any Catholics anyway. There's a story of him actually hearing it as a Catholic telephonist in his office. So he refuses to answer the phone. He's terrified to answer the phone because he thinks all Catholics are secessionists and treasonous. She loses her job or she's moved to another department. And then he starts answering his phone again. So there is this inbuilt discrimination against Catholics in housing, in employment, obviously with security. When the full force of the Special Powers Acts come into play in June 1922, they really go against Catholics. Internal audit Catholics, flogging Catholics. A brutal form of punishment and very humiliating for the nationalist community. So there wasn't anything for the Catholics to be hopeful for or even embrace at that stage, and it generally did get progressively worse as well.
Now, I'm going to ask you a very counterfactual question, Cormac. I know it's something that we shouldn't do, but What do you think could have been done differently by nationalists and Republicans at the time, the Dublin government and Northern nationalists, to alleviate the worst effects of partition in terms of separation between North and South?
Well, the first thing they could have done, and actually it should have done, is actually have a clear policy actually on the North. And what is our policy here? That's one thing that strikes me. They had no clear policy. They're all over the shop. Like De Valera was 1 minute saying we were going to coerce Ulster to come in, you're going to use force if we have to. Another minute said we will never use force. And they had no policy on, okay, Ulster Unionists will come in if the British are out. But how is that going to work? You don't generally talk to Ulster Unionists. You use threatening language against them, as they do against you as well. We have to be aware of. But what is your policy though? How are you going to solve this, what seems like an intractable problem? So there were a lot of things. They should have had a clear strategy, and actually they should have engaged with Joseph Devlin, even though he was from a different political party. He knew the North better than most other nationalist representatives. They engaged and tried to be unified on this issue from a nationalist perspective. That was one of the Unionists' main strengths. They were unified when it came to the national question. If there was more unity within nationalism at the time, you could have had better solutions. Even with the treaty, they could have done their homework more. The British were so well prepared for the treaty. They got to know through Dublin Castle and other people in Ireland who the Sinn Féin delegates were, what they could and could not agree to, what they said in the past. The Sinn Féin delegation didn't seem to know much about the British delegation. Now, they always said they didn't like the start of the game of politics, but they were negotiating with the British, so they should have done their homework at least. If they were going to go down the political route, as in embrace working with unionists, they could have made the Council of Ireland work. That was still there. It was actually the Irish government who gladly, with Ulster Unionists, gladly got rid of it in 1925. And that could have been a way of actually having kind of an all-Ireland solution, get these North-South bodies work, which have obviously proved very successful with Good Friday Agreement. There are a lot of measures they could have taken. They could have gone many different avenues. But the most important thing was they should have had a clear strategy from when they realised partition is a big issue. This is going to be a real issue. We have to do something about this. And they put their head in the sand for way too long before events had kind of overtook them, and it was kind of too late in many respects, by the summer of 1921 to kind of affect real change. My main issue is, why didn't they have a clear policy on the North?
And, one narrative of the period is that you have two states in Ireland that emerge and they're equal but opposite. One's Protestant state for a Protestant people, in James Craig phrase. The one south of the border is heavily Catholic, and in the 1937 Constitution, its preamble says it's a special position for the Catholic Church and so on. What do you make of that argument, Cormac? They're two equal but opposite sectarian states.
In my respects, the South did become a Catholic state. I think it's overplayed a bit, that argument, I would think, to a large degree. I think the Constitution was not as Catholic as a lot of people, certainly is not as Catholic as the Catholic Church would have wanted. But it was, it took on all of the paraphernalia of a Catholic state, and the Catholic Moors and the Catholic Church had huge power over the state for decades. As Northern Ireland become a Protestant state for 50 years, where Catholics were discriminated against. We also have to look at how Protestants were treated in Ireland. Many Protestants got on with their lives in the South, and most of them kept their professions. A lot of them kept their wealth. They weren't as openly discriminated as Catholics were in the North. Many did leave. There's a huge decline in population from 1911 to 1926. We don't know the exact reasons for that, but certainly partition was a big one. There is no question that religion definitely defined both states for many decades.
Cormac, what was the relationship like between the two states in Ireland from the Boundary Commission up until things started to thaw a bit with Lemass and O'Neill?
Craig, when he said he didn't want to change to the boundary, this conference in 1925 where the Boundary Commission report is shelved and they keep the status quo, the Irish Free State government knew they were in trouble with keeping things the way they were, because there was such expectation within nationalism that there would be wholesale changes. And Kevin Higgins said, look, we need something. And even a Lord Salisbury, a peer of the Conservative Party, he said, look, why don't we have a Catholic ombudsman, someone like Joseph Devlin that would safeguard minority rights in the North, do something about policing as well, try and get more Catholics in police. And Craig didn't want to have anything to do with that. So he goes, and he wants to scrap the Council of Ireland as well. And he goes, look, why don't we do this? We scrap the Council of Ireland. The British will, you can be forego from a lot of your war debts, which the Southern government accepts. And instead of the Council of Ireland, we meet up regularly. they agreed to that. And what happens? The first time a Northern Ireland Prime Minister meets a Southern Ireland head of state is in the 60s with the Lemass meet O'Neill. They go further and farther apart politically. They do communicate in areas like agriculture, particularly when it comes to foot and mouth disease, disease of animals and all of that. There's a small bit of cooperation there. And they actually have a cooperation with railways, the Great Northern Railway in the 50s, and also the Erne hydroelectric scheme. But that was like pulling hen's teeth to the hydroelectric scheme, even though it was beneficial for both jurisdictions to have the ESB were going to suck a lot of the water from the Erne, which would have freed up the land in Fermanagh to use for agriculture and so on. And obviously the south was going to get electricity. So it was beneficial for both states. Ireland was in favour, but it took years for Northern Ireland government to cooperate in any way with the south. So most other issues, they didn't talk to each other, they didn't communicate with each other on a political level. They had very little to do with each other.
In between then and now, of course, is the Northern Ireland conflict, the Troubles. But during the Troubles, surprisingly in some ways, the constitutional question was never really as up in the air as perhaps it is now, Cormac.
Well, the numbers just weren't there, I think, as well. There was a poll in the 70s, and that was decisive. Now, obviously, the Nationalists didn't participate in the poll, but it was a decisive win for people staying in the Union. The arithmetic has changed now, and that's the reality, and we all know that. We all know that there is a day when there will be a border poll. Now, I don't know when that's going to be. I don't even know when that should be, but there is going to be a border poll. Personally, I think we should wait until we're pretty sure it's going to pass. Look what happened in Scotland. If they hadn't voted in 2014, it could be independent at this stage after Brexit. But I think let's wait and see what the numbers are like. And obviously Brexit has changed everything. In terms of that physical border is there as well. The dynamics changed a lot since it was in 2016. When we look at how the Easter Rising was commemorated, the dynamics changed a lot now as well. But you have at that mind that the arithmetic has changed, and unionists realise that they're no longer in the majority. And they were in the majority pretty much throughout the whole Troubles.
Well, thank you very much, Cormac. That was Dr. Cormac Moore. All the issues we've been talking about today, you'll find in Cormac's book, Birth of the Border, The Impact of Partition in Ireland. It's a really great read, and it's well worth getting yourself a copy of. So if you'd like to listen to this or any previous episodes of the show, you can go to irishhistoryshow.ie. We have a full archive of all our previous episodes there. You can follow us on Twitter, @IrishHistoryPod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you hear an episode that you like, please share it on your social media. We really, really appreciate it. And we're very grateful for all the feedback we get off you, the listeners. So until next time, my name is Cathal Brennan, and on behalf of myself and my co-presenter, John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.